The grand ballroom of the charity gala was filled with the who's who of society, business moguls, celebrities, politicians, and philanthropists, all gathered to raise funds for underprivileged children. The chandeliers above sparkled like a sky full of stars, and the hum of polite conversations mixed with the clinking of champagne glasses. Among the elegantly dressed guests was Barron Trump, standing tall in a tailored navy blue suit, his presence commanding yet humble. At only 18, he had already become known for his intelligence and quiet charisma, carrying himself with grace beyond his years. As he scanned the room, offering polite smiles and nods, something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. His breath hitched slightly. An older woman stood near the back of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, wearing a simple, modest dress that contrasted with the extravagance around her. Her face was familiar. More than familiar. Barron squinted, his mind racing through memories. Then it hit him. Mrs. Evans. His middle school English teacher. The woman who had shaped his love for reading, who had always encouraged him, who had been one of the few people in his early years who saw him not as the son of a billionaire, but as Barron, the curious young boy eager to learn. A warmth spread through his chest, but so did concern. What was she doing here? And why did she look tired? Barron excused himself from the conversation he was having with an investor and made his way through the crowd. His security detail instinctively moved to follow, but he held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. As he approached, Mrs. Evans was busy admiring a display of children's artwork, drawings made by the very kids the charity aimed to help. She hadn't noticed him yet. Mrs. Evans. At the sound of her name, she turned around. Her eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her chest. "Barron?" she gasped, blinking rapidly as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Oh my goodness. Look at you." Barron grinned. "It's really me. I can't believe it's you. What are you doing here?" She let out a breathy chuckle. I volunteer here. The organization helps provide books and educational materials for children in low-income areas. It's something I've always been passionate about, as you might remember. Barron's chest tightened. Of course, he remembered. She had always gone above and beyond for her students. "I do remember," he said with a warm smile. "You always made sure every student had a book to read, even if it meant buying them yourself." Mrs. Evans chuckled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Well, some things never change." Barron frowned slightly, picking up on something in her tone. "Are you here alone?" Her smile faltered just a little. "Yes. I lost my husband last year." She hesitated before adding softly, "And, well, retirement hasn't been as easy as I thought. But helping these kids keeps me going." Barron felt a lump form in his throat. This woman had given so much of herself to her students, to children who needed her. And yet, here she was, struggling quietly, unnoticed in a room full of powerful people. "Mrs. Evans, why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you reach out?" She shook her head, offering a small, tired smile. "Oh, Barron, teachers don't do what we do for recognition. We do it because we love it. Knowing I made even a small difference is enough for me." His heart ached at her words. She had given everything, and asked for nothing in return. He looked around the room, then back at her. That didn't sit right with him. "Come with me," he said suddenly, reaching for her hand. Mrs. Evans blinked. "What?" "Oh, no, I don't want to cause a scene." "Trust me," Barron said, leading her toward the front of the hall where the night speakers were addressing the audience. As they reached the front, the crowd slowly fell silent, all eyes turning toward them. The cameras from various news outlets shifted focus, curious about what was happening. Barron picked up the microphone, his voice strong, yet full of emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll allow me a moment to acknowledge someone incredibly special tonight." Murmurs rippled through the audience. "This is Mrs. Evans," he continued, glancing at her before turning back to the crowd. "She was my teacher many years ago, but she was so much more than that. She didn't just teach English, she taught kindness, patience, and the importance of never giving up on people." Mrs. Evans shifted uncomfortably, her eyes welling up. Barron took a deep breath. She spent her own money to make sure kids had books. She stayed after school to help struggling students. She made a difference in my life and in so many others. And yet, tonight, I find out that she's been struggling alone. The audience fell completely silent. "That doesn't sit right with me," Barron said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tonight, in her honor, I am donating $500,000 to this charity, so that no child will ever have to go without the education they deserve." A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by thunderous applause. Mrs. Evans gasped, her hand covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "Barron. That's too much. He turned to her, his expression soft yet firm. "It's the least I can do. You gave me something that money could never buy. You believed in me. Let me give back." Tears fell freely down Mrs. Evans's cheeks as she shook her head, overwhelmed with emotion. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Barron gently took her hands in his. "Just promise me one thing." She sniffled, nodding. "Anything. Promise me you'll never struggle alone again." Mrs. Evans let out a shaky laugh, squeezing his hands tightly. "I promise." The audience rose to their feet, applauding not just the donation, but the beautiful moment between a student and the teacher who had shaped him. That night, the headlines weren't about politics or wealth. They were about gratitude. About the power of a teacher's impact. About a young man who, despite his name and privilege, had never forgotten the woman who once guided him. And as Barron led Mrs. Evans to a seat of honor, she realized something she had always told her students but had never expected to feel so deeply herself. Kindness always comes full circle,